I am a specialist with the Wisconsin Cancer Collaborative. This call today is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be made available after the call today. If you are experiencing technical difficulty, please use the chat for assistance or the help options within Zoom. So we are delighted to have so many new people join us today, along with our existing members. And for those who might not be as familiar with us, we are the Wisconsin Cancer Collaborative. We are Wisconsin's comprehensive cancer coalition comprised of 140 organizations working together to reduce the burden of cancer for everyone in Wisconsin. If you are not yet a member, we'd love to have you join. Membership is free. If you're interested in joining, you can do so at the link listed here on the screen. So now just to quickly go over today's agenda, I'm going to welcome Scout, who is our presenter today, and then we his presentation, followed by a question and answer section. So we are so thrilled to announce this month's speaker, Scout. Scout is the Executive Director of the National LGBT Cancer Network and the Principal Investigator of the CDC-funded LGBTQ Tobacco-Related Cancer Disparities Network. In this capacity, he spends much of his time providing technical assistance for governmental tobacco and cancer, focusing agencies expanding their reach and engagement with the LGBTQ populations. He leads a team of specialists in the Rhode Island office who focus especially on building and sharing strategies across state departments of health. Scout, I will hand it over to you now, so feel free to unmute your mic and take it away.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. My mic was already unmuted, so I guess I just was quiet. You can hear me fine, right? Okay, great. All right, so it looks like Alex got a hold of me because they had heard a presentation that we did for Wisconsin tobacco control and thought that that might be interesting to bring to you all as well. So we're super excited to be here. I've changed the tobacco presentation a bit to make it a little bit more cancer focused. But I also want to just kind of clarify that we've got an hour and a half here, and I am more than happy to either run through an endless number of slides or to talk with you about the types of things and challenges and experiences that and issues that you're experiencing locally or that you've faced in your practice related to this population. So I just want to say that feel free to take me as far off of these slides as possible. It only makes it more interesting for me if that's the case. So with that, let me also start. Can you go to the next slide? Let me also start and ask you all a question, because I find the best way to do that, you already know who I am, I guess. So let's say this is what we've got as our agenda. But again, we can dive as deep as we want into what specific issues are that you're experiencing. So if I can ask everybody so we can start kind of chatting in the text box to answer a little getting to know you questions. So my question today will be, how many people in your immediate friend and family group do you have that are LGBTQ plus? And I'll put down my answer, lots, umpteens. Oh, Jennifer, all right then. Excellent. Sarah, Deborah, Sally, Tracy, Mara, lots again too. Rissa, Joshua, Hannah, also lots possibly. 2, 1, Courtney, excellent. Caitlin, Alexandria, Jenna, Allison. Okay, excellent. So it looks like we've got, and keep doing it if you haven't put it in there. So it looks like we've got a range. Obviously, there's some people who are pretty well embedded in the communities. And then there's some people who are clearly interested in trying to do a good job of outreaching to communities, but don't have any direct connections themselves. So I also encourage you during this to just remember, we don't want to privilege the information I have. If you've got information around any of these issues, feel free to also, start chatting in the chat box, because, we will go back to our national stuff, whatever we do in our little national wonderland. but you, of course, are your allies with each other. And so you can be support to each other as you move forward as different people in Wisconsin and beyond, obviously, because we have our one New York person on the call, are trying to figure out how to continue to address these issues as we go forward. So thanks, I appreciate that. And wait, actually, can we go back one, Alex? So what I've got on the slate so far today is I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are, what we kind of know and understand related to cancer in our communities. And then I'm going to go back a little bit. And I know for some people, well, for everybody, the terminology is changing. I literally, I think in the last 2 weeks, came up with several new acronyms that the team at the Cancer Network didn't even know about. So the terminology is always changing. So we're going to kind of go into that and give you some both operating rules for what you should remember, what you don't have to worry about remembering, and how to feel a little bit more comfortable that you can talk without feeling like you're always tripping over your own shoelaces. And then we're going to talk a little bit about data and what we know also about the population and some interesting and unexpected things you might not realize about the population, even particularly in Wisconsin. And then we're going to go through our best practices, which interestingly, we first pulled them together in 2007. And it really is the case that from 2007 all the way till now, we still really are kind of doing a lot of our trainings based upon these kind of fundamental 7 principles of if you can achieve these 7 things, you're going to be a much more welcoming provider, and you will be presenting a different front to the queer community than so many cancer organizations are around the country. And then of course, we got to leave you with action steps because we don't want to overwhelm you with information or just have this be something where you're just listening. The whole point is to try and help people act more. So we're going to be going through those things. I actually would suggest that maybe with our hour and a half, that people ask questions more as we go instead of wait to the end. We can dig into more things at the end if you want, but don't wait. If you've got a question, I'm watching the chat box. And again, your goal is not to bore me because I've heard myself talk before, okay? So feel free as much as possible to throw things in there, okay? Is that a deal? Yes? Can all give us a yes? Yes, keep checking. Exactly. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay. So who are we as the National LGBT Cancer Network? Next slide, please. Good. So now I'm getting dizzy. Don't do that to me, Alex. Okay. So our mission is to educate our own communities about the disproportionate impact that cancer has on us. And sadly, one of the unfortunate truths is we're pretty unfamiliar with it. I remember when I first got into LGBTQ plus health, I'm kind of like, but our bodies are the same, right? And I really didn't understand that health disparities is really, unfortunately, the stronger rule related to so many health outcomes. I think that's one of the things that COVID has really put into crisp focus, that health disparities are real and not fake, right? So we do a lot of educating our own populations about what health disparities we have related to cancer, what kinds of things should change, what you should expect, how to get the kind of cancer care and treatment you deserve. And then we also, within the cancer communities, we do a lot of advocating to try and make sure that cancer organizations that are not queer specific, presumably like a lot of the places where you work, are doing a good job of reaching us. And like I said, we kind of find that there's still so much progress to be made in that area. The needle is moving, absolutely, but it would be really great if, 14 years after we introduced the best practices, we had new next level best practices, right? Instead, sadly, a lot of them are still the same. And then we also do training like this to either healthcare providers, policymakers, different things like that to help people do a better job of engagement. And I'm sorry, let me read the Jennifer's thing. Jennifer, we've been at Milwaukee Pride. Yeah, exactly. So people didn't understand much about the disparities in the community. And if they did, so what do you mean? What they did know or how they knew related. So you're saying it was interesting to see those who did know and how they knew. So tell us more about that. And we can go to the next slide too. We're gonna have 3 conversations at once. I swear it's gonna be better than a regular slide deck. So we are funded by CDC to be one of the 8 cancer and tobacco disparity networks. I think it's actually a really great model. Some states have actually replicated the model at the state level. It means that we're kind of on hand as a resource provider for all those CDC grantees. And that means they all have access to the 8 different disparity networks that they can talk to about, whether they need to do better job outreaching to the American Indian population, whatever it is, they have experts on hand to talk to. And so just to tell you that all of the 8 different disparity networks do the same types of things. We're all asked by CDC to do these 6 things. We have to identify knowledge gaps in the field. We have to offer trainings. We have to create and find other knowledge pieces to disseminate out in the population. We have to build partnerships and create connections between members, offer technical assistance to members, and then we also create and advise on media strategies. So if you're interested in other overlapping disparity populations too, know that there are 7 other sibling networks out here that also do the same type of stuff and would probably also be willing to come and present and everything like that. Now we're going to pause for the second half of Jennifer's thing. So to clarify, some are either experienced disparities themselves or family loved ones who did. Others have heard horror stories behind cancer screening and general primary care help, for example, trans folks, that cause hesitation to seek care. Yeah, does anybody know, is anybody familiar with the phrase associative trauma, which for my sociology thing was a big deal? Associative trauma, of course, is not necessarily something I've experienced, but what people in my immediate community have experienced. And certainly as a queer person, it seems to be a role that if I haven't experienced a negative situation with healthcare, I definitely know someone who has. And those situations can, and one of the things we can talk about is that while some of those experiences may have been way back in history, that thing that happened the first time I went to get prophylactic care when I was young, that left me, let's just say, physically in a lot of pain and pretty upset and not wanting to ever go back to see a provider like that again. It doesn't matter if it happened in my teenage years and I'm 55 now, I still absolutely remember it and carry it around with me, right? So even if there's some of the current behavior is changing, we still carry all the scars of the things that have happened to us throughout our whole life. Oh yeah, also how big tobacco targets various marginalized communities, including LGBTQA+. Yeah, we realize we know so little about tobacco impact. If you think about it, that if you ask queer people, what are our health priorities? We will almost always say HIV. But just as an example, we know that HIV, when it is successfully managed, which is not always the case and certainly not for underserved populations, it can become a chronic health issue, right? We also know that it affects about 655,000 queer people in the country, roughly. In comparison, smoking kills about half the people, and it affects about 2 to 3 million queer people in the country. So if you actually just look at that in epidemiological terms, tobacco use is a huge health risk that our population has. Yet across the country, survey and survey, if you ask us what our priorities are, most of us won't even put tobacco on there because we don't understand how it impacts us. Great points. All right, next slide. So just to tell you, we have a whole series of resources. I'm going to showcase some of them in this slide deck, but we've got many more. And we have a tendency to try and highlight them on our monthly newsletters. And can you go to the next slide too, please? We've got a lot of them on our online resource library. So there's lots of things I'm going to talk about here where if you ask where can I find that, I'm going to keep saying go to our resource library. And then if you can go to the next slide. If you're not already a member, I know the Cancer Collaborative is, Wisconsin Cancer Collaborative, but if your organization is not already a member or you're not on our mailing list, then Gabe is going to, thank you, Gabe. And Gabe is my compatriot on this call who's doing a lot of backup stuff as I say things. So he's going to put up the link. He already put up the link to the resource library there in chat, and he's going to put up the link for where you can become a member or sign up for our listserv if you're not already getting this stuff. Membership is absolutely free. We simply ask that you are interested in doing a better job with queer outreach, or if you do it already, that you're interested in teaching or sharing any resources you've developed around it so that we can obviously help other people do a better job too. So again, absolutely free. Fill that out in the membership form if you're interested. The membership's kind of organizational, and then there's also a different one to sign up for if you want to be on our mailing list. So there may be a totally different form just to be on our mailing list. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go through now some of what we know related to cancer in our communities, which is primarily, unfortunately, defined by the vast areas we don't have information because there's lack of data collection. But where we do have information, we see the problems that we might expect. Next slide, please. Right now, it's interesting because in my years of doing this, it used to be that tobacco or smoking, cigarette smoking, was 60% higher than Gen Pop. Then it went to 50, then it went to 40. But then at some point, we started not measuring smoking, but tobacco use instead, because there were all these alternate tobacco products, right? So just so you know, that's turned the direction of the disparity around. And now we're back up to 50% of a tobacco use disparity compared to non-queers. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But unfortunately, it means that all the work to try and reduce the disparity is being completely undone by these new tobacco products. Rates of vaping or e-cigarette use are also absolutely higher. We know that most smokers begin using tobacco, it's usually around 12 or 13, right? And that usually holds the same for the queer population as well. So if you think about it, it's a time where around puberty, many of us are coming to the awareness that like either we don't want to date that person or we don't want to grow into the person that we seem to have been assigned at birth. One of those things is going on. And so it's for queer youth a time of kind of real social isolation and vulnerability. And remember, we don't always have acceptance in families or in schools for this type of thing. So at the same time we have that extra social isolation, of course, tobacco use is there with like, well, we're going to help you be the cool kid. We're going to help you fit in with other people. We're going to help you reduce your stress, quote unquote, right? Even though we know it actually causes the stress, but it sells itself as a stress reducer. And as we said, we do not rate tobacco use as an important health issue, despite its ranking as far as really what it takes as far as our toll. Next slide, please. And then sometimes the data doesn't collect trans. So just to put it there very specifically, our latest full population trans data is that 36.8% is the current US smoking rate for trans folks. And across the full population, it's about 14%. Although that's dropped a little bit, but at the time that this was measured in 2015, it was 50% higher. We also know that using cigarettes, e-cigarettes, or anything like that correlates with other life stressors. For example, as a trans guy, if I can pass and people don't realize I'm trans when I walk down the street, so I'm not constantly having people come at me because they realize I'm gender nonconforming and not what they might think of as normal or something like that. If I don't get that kind of noise, I'm more likely not to be using cigarettes or any other nicotine related products. On the other hand, if I can't pass and I get that noise coming at me all the time, I'm much more likely to be using these things. In the same way, if I have family acceptance for being trans, I am less likely to be using any of those tobacco products. If I do not have the family acceptance, I'm more likely to be using all those tobacco products. Same thing with if I'm higher income, I'm less likely to be using. You get the sense? If I'm lower income, I'm more likely to be using. So we see all these life stressors that just have a direct pathway between that and whether you're using these tobacco products. Also, higher cigar use in the trans community. You don't usually find that across the general queer population, but in the trans community, yes. All right, next slide. And actually, I'm missing my big stat on this. So Gabe, note to us, we got to fix this. The big stat is we have the latest available data shows that 1/3 of our youth are getting addicted to nicotine via e-cigarettes right now. So for our youth population, it's a huge health problem that's really changing the dynamic. And it was interesting because I was actually on some FDA-sponsored focus groups with youth who were tobacco users. And it was just so interesting the way they'd talk about, as a homeless guy, because his parents had kicked him out and he was a very young person, he would use cigarettes to warm himself up, or people would talk about how all their friends were were either vaping, using e-cigarettes, not as much actually the other cigarettes. He had a lot of people talking about using all these other products, which we know now, unfortunately, lead to cigarette use later, right? So again, we see some of these real direct correlations between the stress that you feel for being queer and then their uptaking of these health risk scenarios. We also there's another set of information that I'm gonna keep saying Gabe every time I want to have a reminder to put this on here. We just got some recent data out of California that showed that people were actually considering cigarette use their own internalized queer phobia. They basically considered it a type of self-harm that they were smoking, knowing that it was so bad for themselves, but they labeled it as their own internalized kind of queer phobia. And so it was their own way to kind of create damage on themselves based upon that mainstream population identity or that ideology. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I talked to you about those higher smoking rates. We know that that's correlated with a huge amount of the cancers that are out there. We also know, just FYI, that there's real challenges related to accessing care, as had been talked about. A study came out recently in the trans community with a really trans welcoming provider center. And the interesting thing was when they looked at the trans population, they were originally trying to be like, are we giving them their cancer screenings? Because maybe we're not really giving them the indicated screenings for their body parts because their assigned sex isn't matching their body parts, right? And what they found out to their surprise was that cancer screening rates for the trans population, again, in this very welcoming center, were 40, 50, and 60% lower than the general population. And I may have this out of order, but it was for breast, cervical, and colorectal cancer. The weird thing about that is, as you know, 2 of those, breast and cervical cancer, have to do with body parts for your assigned sex at birth, but everybody has a rectum. So they were confused as to why there would be such a disparity related to the screening rates for colorectal cancer. And I think as a trans person, that's obvious to me. The idea of having to go to a new doctor and deal with disrobing in front of a new doctor, and especially if it's colorectal cancer, if you're going for something like the colonoscopy, that means you have to go to a whole new medical center and deal with a whole bunch of people, not even kind of the other annoying parts of colonoscopies, but you have to like have a whole practice of people that you're suddenly disclosing that you're trans and then trying to understand if they're going to be trans welcoming. And, you know, I don't know about the rest of you, but as a trans guy, every time I have a new provider, I've got to call that provider up and be like, hey, I'm trans, and then just try and get a sense of what's their reaction. Is it something I feel comfortable with? You know, I usually ask them if they've had trans patients. And despite the fact that I'm in a really trans-friendly state, they always say no. So I have to kind of get a sense from that whether I feel comfortable going there. So we have these other examples of provider avoidance that are really real. Another big study that we had, and I'm going to say Gabe again here because I actually want to put these 2 studies in here, is that there was a study of oncology providers, and in that they basically found that after a little bit of information around the queer communities, 60% of oncologists determined that they didn't know enough in order to treat LGBT people well. And 80% of oncologists determined that self-described themselves as not knowing enough to treat trans people well. So 60 and 88% are pretty high numbers. So imagine now, it's one of the things that some of you had talked about, that there were no specialty care people to refer to, and that's a real challenge. And it really is the case in even some very welcoming areas, much less once you get out to the more rural populations. And there's kind of no magic thing for us to talk about related to that, except one of the things that Callan Lord, which is a big New York-based queer community center, queer health center, and has a very large trans population does, and has done for decades now, is their providers do that same kind of calling that I've talked about in advance. So in other words, if my doctor says, go to like the dermatologist, which happened to me recently, okay, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming in, which I'm glad I was, because it was actually cancer and it's gotten it all taken care of and everything like that. But here I am, the head of the cancer network, and I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into a dermatologist because it was a new provider. I didn't want to figure out if they were welcoming. I didn't want to deal with all that, right? So I just kind of say that to show how real this is. But instead of me calling some random dermatologist saying, hi, I'm trans, and trying to gauge how they respond, what Callan Lord would be doing is my provider calls some other provider and says, I've got a trans patient. I just want to make sure that they're going to encounter a welcoming environment there. If you don't feel comfortable, please tell me now, because I'm going to suggest someone else, and then I'll call that person and make sure that that person is welcoming. So honestly, as far as trying to how to find specialty people, that's the best tool we have right now, is to do a little bit of the ice breaking instead of having your patients have to do that ice breaking. Because if my provider had said to me, hey, I've got a dermatologist, total trans welcoming, and get back to me if you have any issues, because they assured me they were trans welcoming, that would have made a big difference. I probably would have gone to the dermatologist sooner. And yes, absolutely, prostate cancer is also an issue because, well, anal pap smears. A lot of oncologists don't even know that you should be doing anal pap smears for anybody who is assigned, who has a prostate, and because the chance of HPV is much higher in the male or trans female population, male gay, bi, or trans female population, and that's very associated with cancer, obviously. So the idea that we don't even have these anal pap smears kind of in the toolbox for cancer providers is a big miss. Oh, and non-colonoscopy screening methods for colon cancer. Thank you, Noelle. I will be looking into that next time this comes out. All right, so with that, let's go forward, and we're going to talk about you from the Wisconsin Cancer Collaborative. Did I get that right, Alex? Your new name, not your old name. You are already partners on our big cancer survey right now that we're running. And so I love that, and thank you very much for that. These are actually some findings from the last time we did this survey, which was a while ago. We don't expect the findings to change, but we're really delighted that the new one is going to give us more diversity of information and a much bigger range of voices. But nonetheless, from the last time when we asked people, a much smaller group of people, if you had to give a class to healthcare workers focused on cancer care, what would you tell them about your experience about being diagnosed with cancer? And I'm going to run through, next slide, please, the different classes of categories of what they came back with. Okay. First one, they said stigma is a huge issue for us in healthcare. Next slide. And here we have an example. I'm not going to read it, but you can see that every time, just as I was describing, this person had to go near a new person, even if it was not someone you had to get naked with or anything like that. You just were always wondering, was that person welcoming? Was that person welcoming? And you had to watch out for yourself. And I'm actually going to even up this a little bit, and I'm saying Gabe again because I would like to. There's a friend of mine that is dealing with cancer right now, and she recently just put up a post, and she's a trans woman, very publicly trans woman. She ran for office, but she recently put up a post that for her, every single trip in to get chemotherapy was like bracing for a car crash because of the treatment that she was expecting. And she is in a major metropolitan area. She is incredibly well connected to trans advocates, advisors, and allies. And this is yet what one person is experiencing trying to go in for the cancer care. So this concept of watching out for yourself, bracing for a car crash is an insane thing to think about if you're just trying to get cancer care. Next slide. So what are the recommendations here? You have to, as providers, and be thinking about this to understand how you're going to offset this, right? You can't expect the patients to be offsetting it. These are the mountains that are in front of them. You as a provider can show them the path through those mountains, but only if you're not doing business as usual, right? So providing cultural competency training, and not just for the people who are willing to come here, but of course for the people who don't want to come here because they don't want to have this training, right? And this isn't actually a cultural competency training as we do it. We have a separate thing that's cultural competency trainings. So if you're interested for your organization, get a hold of us. We had a hard time at first moving to virtual, but I think we've got that ace now. And we can work out an agreement if you're trying to bring cultural competency training to your organization. And then also include queer leaders on your community advisory bodies. Because, and I like that, Wisconsin Transgender Health Coalition has a statewide trans family healthcare provider directory. I love that. And we're going to give an example later of also how you all can help goose the number of people they have in that provider directory. So Carrie, how many people do you have now? Let me ask you that question. And then, so include queer leaders on advisory bodies. You're going to see that a few different times in this presentation, because again, in that theory, like we can come and talk to you about queer a little bit, but your real resources are people like Carrie and Jennifer and the other people locally who are doing work in this area or know about work resources in this area and can continue this momentum to make each of these practices more welcoming and more accepting. And one of the best ways to do that is to get people on your advisory body, because then they can, they're sitting there thinking about how you can be more welcoming all year long instead of just getting one little training and then we disappear. Next slide. So the next big theme we had from the other survey is that the local environment determines your experience and is highly variable. Next one. So I should change the gray on this. So here's someone talking about their local hospital was like a St. Mary's or something like that. And I know some of them are the most welcoming places in the world. Some of them are not so much. We were working with Missouri at one point where they realized that so many of their local hospitals didn't have anything up about non-discrimination. And they took about 6 months to do a campaign, one of the Missouri organizations, to get all those hospitals to post stuff about non-discrimination and become more welcoming and commit to becoming more welcoming. And they moved up in the HRC rankings where they have healthcare quality index of welcoming hospitals. They moved up from like 47th in the country in 6 months of calling hospitals and being like, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? Put it on your website, things like that, right? From like 47th in the country to like 6th in the country as far as number of welcoming hospitals. So again, there's a huge amount of change you can create. And this was from a junior staff person at a local organization who just was kind of like a terrier, kept calling the hospitals and being like, when you don't say anything and we can't find anything that shows that we're welcome, that means it's a hostile environment for us. And actually, here's another Gabe thing for another note. They had a very recent study showing that 42% of the comp cancer centers, NCI designated, actually not comp cancer, NCI designated cancer centers, which is even the higher level, and comp cancer centers as well, 42% did not even have gender identity anywhere on their public materials saying that they had non-discrimination against my group of people. So the idea that the best of the best cancer places in the country aren't even saying that they're non-discriminatory is unfortunately a sad miss related to it. Okay, a question. Thank you, Mara. I really appreciate that. Okay, first of all, sorry, Carrie, didn't mean to put you in the wrong place. And thanks for giving them a shout out. And then, excellent, Milwaukee Tobacco Free Alliance folks are doing queer stuff. Absolutely, they've been doing that for quite a long time and we really love them. We've got some innovative things they've been doing. Then a question about trans cancer survivors. A friend who's trans woman and childhood cancer survivor encountered several providers said that starting hormone therapy as part of transition would be too dangerous, but later found out other providers who disagreed. Any thoughts from the providers about weighing potential cancer risk versus risk of not transitioning non-hormonal transition? We've had this question actually a few different times come up recently. And there is, we have actually gotten we found some literature on it for case examples. And we've also asked the head trans provider at Callan Lord about their response to this. And it isn't something that as a non-clinician, it was easy for me to remember because the answer was in most cases, proceed with hormones. But there's a specific type of case where you might want to pause hormones because of their interaction with cancer care. So if Gabe, you can also make a note of that, we can look back and find that answer. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Noel. Yeah, well, I think we may have found that pretty decent opinion again, because we got that big person, the person who sees so many trans people and many of them with cancer too. But we'll come back to you with that answer because it is, you really do have to be careful about the stress of not having hormones. And so in many cases, it did seem like it was appropriate. But yeah, good point, Noel. We definitely want to get the real opinions and not have the non-clinicians weigh in on that stuff. But it's a great lens to make sure, and you're absolutely right in identifying that the idea of stopping or not allowing the beginning of hormones for people is going to create a lot of mental and emotional stress. So that's the kind of things we want the providers to be thinking about instead of just saying, I'm not sure, so no, right? Because that's something that can, trust me, my hormones were delayed by a week last week. I had an issue with it, and that's only a week. No one asked me to go off them for a year or anything like that. So it's very much something that is going to affect people's lives. breast, uterine, and prostate cancer. So Noelle, is that because they have more hormonal interactions or are more hormonally driven? The word hormone suddenly can't come out of my mouth.
Yeah, if I can unmute for a second, it's
Yeah.
not that, Scout, it's that the hormones can actually make the cancer worse. So it's usually shared
They're
decision.
like a petri dish.
The cancer cells for those cancers may have receptors for those hormones. So you may be giving them a carcinogen. Not that they can't do that, but it should be a pretty complicated conversation with the patient, shared decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as like another thought related to this, we also know in some of the very little information we know about some risk factors, if you give hormones by different routes for trans women, if you give estrogen by either an injected or an oral route, it has a very different level of impact on their cardiovascular risk. So, you know, hormones are dicey. I think as anybody who's been pregnant always tells us. Okay, next one. Hey, Mara, what has been NED for a decade? I don't even know what NED means. Noelle, I need you again. Oh, thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that. All right, so the recommendations for this one. So obviously, if you are in a place that's not actively conveying a welcome, then you're part of the problem. I gently say that and lovingly say that, but I also say it because it should be fixed. And then also you should convey a zero tolerance policy for any discriminatory behavior on the part of any staff. And I say that because you really need to, hopefully from the top of your organization, have people showing that this is what we expect our staff to do. And that means if someone decides that they have their own personal opinions that differ, that they don't feel that that's something that's okay to take to the workplace, right? So you need to broadcast your policies, not just to your patient population, obviously to your staff population, and then provide the staff with training as needed to support it as well. Thanks. All right. And thanks, Noelle, for the ongoing advisement there. All right, so disclosures often received related to perceived safety. I get a question a fair amount. What can we do to help people disclose? What about people who don't disclose? And the answer is always the same. Let them be. We are not going to be able to help. I mean, the better thing, if you really care about whether people are disclosing or not that they're queer, is work on the safety of your organization. Don't worry about the people who aren't disclosing yet. Got a million reasons that they don't think it's safe enough to do so. But if you can provide them with more safety in your organization, they're more likely to. Just an example, when I started this work, I went out to Kansas. And we had people from the rural counties in Kansas being like, actually, we don't have any queers here. Not surprisingly, luckily I'd come armed with my numbers and was able to say, actually, on recent full probability studies, it looks like the number of queers in Kansas has increased by 200% in all the counties. So what was going on there? As I threw it out to them, I'm like, are people flocking to Kansas who are queer? Not our guess. Our guess is that people were feeling more safe related to disclosure. And so as they feel like it's a safer place to be who they really are, you're at that point going to get more people coming out. Okay, next one, please. And then again, as an example of people are talking about what disclosure means for themselves, and again, bracing themselves for that rejection. Next one. So what can you do there? When we talk about data collection, remember that one important place to do data collection is in patient satisfaction information and in patient population information. And also, honestly, if you have any employee survey, employee satisfaction is another place you should also make sure that you're collecting SGM data, sexual and gender minority data, to make sure that both your employees feel safe and your patients feel safe. You know, I went to do a cancer training in Texas Department of Health, at Texas Department of Health, State Department of Health. And I asked them about how many people do you have in the State Department of Health? I think their answer was 5,000, maybe it was 8,000, but it was a lot of people. And then I said, okay, from all the people in this room, how many do you know that are openly queer? And nobody put their hands up. Nobody knew anybody who's openly queer, even though there were some queer people in the room. So they actually really easily demonstrated that it wasn't a safe environment for their employees to come out. And if your employees can't come out and you don't have your house in order, how do you ever expect to do a good job serving people and asking them to come out? So again, think about your own agency first. All right, next slide. Yes, exactly. Addressing their spouse as a significant other versus a friend or a caregiver. Absolutely. We are actually looking at the new data from this survey. And one of the things that I was just struck by is one of the people saying they had to pretend like their partner was their sister in order to get the person in so that they could be with them during cancer care, which of course is not the way it's supposed to go, right? It's supposed to be different, but in reality, that's what they had to do. And appropriate, we're right up to support teams. So the next big theme we had was respecting the support teams. Next slide. And also remember that our support systems are probably going to be different than the general population. In the sociology world, we often talk about 5 different areas of social support that are usually experienced by people. You've got your home life, you've got your neighborhood, you've got your chosen friends, you've got your work, you've got your birth family, right? Now think of that same thing with a queer lens. How many of those are going to be welcoming? Hopefully your home life is, unless you're a youth, then maybe it isn't, right? Maybe your birth family is, or maybe it isn't. Your work life may not be welcoming, again, especially not if you worked in Texas State Department of Health right then, right? Your neighborhood, for a lot of us, we don't, I lived in Chelsea for a little while. That was very queer welcoming. But in general, our neighborhood's queer welcoming, not in many cases. And then your chosen friends. Hopefully your chosen friends are really welcoming and supportive. But that means that out of the 5 areas of social support that people usually experience, 4 of them, or 3 to 4 of them, could be really weak for queers. That creates some interesting outcomes. Like I remember we were working with someone once with the quit lines, and this guy is saying like, I can't stop going to the bars. Is it just that he was an alcoholic? Is it that, he was, and with quit lines, when they're trying to get you to quit smoking, they usually say, go away from your routine, right? But his reason for not going to the bars was because that's where he was getting all his social support from being a queer guy. So he wasn't getting it from all these other places. He was inordinately dependent on the one place he could find it. And that happened to be a place where people were smoking more. So then you see all these kind of cascade of sequelae and outcome. All right, next slide, please. So then the question would be, is your organization doing a scan to see how support teams are being supported? And are you including information on that on your patient satisfaction surveys? Do that kind of scan. You can even just do sample patient testing kind of thing. Take a few patients who are coming in and ask them how it worked. It doesn't need to be a full survey of every single person, but then use the information you get to do a better job of supporting people. And I'll give another example. So not too long, a while ago, after Obama decided that you had to support people's significant others and let them in the hospitals. And he did that because of that, the one high profile couple, and it happened so many times where one of them passed away and the other one wasn't even allowed in to see them, right? Down in Florida. Well, it happened to be that my mother, who is a lesbian, was in Florida at that time, and their partner had struggled with addiction her whole life and overdosed. And so we were in this scenario where my mother was allowed to be in, right? So that was welcoming, right? But the partner in end of life areas, I'll say this, it was the most kind of welcoming yet horrific scenario. Welcoming was only with big quotes around it. Why? Because they waited for the estranged sister to come in who hadn't talked to the partner in years. That sister then came in, and then while my mother was allowed to be in the room, she was treated as no one. And all the discussions were with the sister. All the decisions were with the sister. My mother was literally at the point one time where she was crying and begging the sister not to pull the plug on her life partner who she'd been engaged to for years because they couldn't marry in Florida at that time without letting her say goodbye first. So some of the steps we think are welcoming. When you then ask people who have gone through the experiences, those people might give you different sense of whether they felt welcome, despite the fact that we might think that we're being very welcoming. So that's why it's really great to ask the people who've really experienced it. All right, next one. Okay, pervasive expectation of gender conformity in cancer. What could that be about? All right, next one. So here we are related to hormones. It's also about pronouns. It's about understanding that the body parts that you experience may not be what you're expecting. And most of the people on here might be thinking, okay, I'm good with this. The question is for you, are the rest of the providers and or people at your organization good with this kind of thing? And next one. Yes, it is. It is also. I absolutely, definitely keep my healthcare power of attorney up to date. Gabe, that's my question for you. Do you have your healthcare power of attorney up to date right now? Yes or no?
I do, and it has my partner on it, so it's all.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yep.
All right, then we can continue with the webinar. But if not, we're just going to stop right then and get that fixed, because it's that kind of thing. So recommendations related to gender expectations. Of course, we know that the big one related to this is like the pink mama bands kind of stuff and the endless pinking of breast cancer. So do a scan of your organization to see where and when you might be presuming this gender confirmation or conformity related to care. Like think about, what do you have out as the signage in the mammography area? If it's not a bright pink mammogram, what do you do? If there is a trans guy who comes in who hasn't had top surgery, or who still needs, I guess who hasn't had top surgery. What do you do with that trans person as they go through the mammography experience? How welcoming is that for them? Are they in an endless pink environment? Are they in the women's section of the cancer care area? One of our providers we work with a lot recently got a fair amount of heat on Instagram because he is the head of women's cancer. And, trans guys were like, that's not women's cancer, that's gynecological cancer, or, other, I think his final title is different than that. It's a little longer than just gynecological. But when you say women's cancer, you're immediately conveying gender conformity, and that's not trans welcoming. So do a scan, see how that is, use the findings to change what you're doing. And then remember that if you have particularly vulnerable patients, it's really important to have ways that those vulnerable patients can check in with you about what their treatment was like, whether that's because you're referring and asking them to check back, or whether that's because you have a big, hey, did you have any problem with your care for any reason, kind of presence at your organization where you allow and encourage people to talk about their care based upon sexual and gender minority status. Next slide. Next big theme, queer survivors needed more culturally appropriate support and information. And this is something that a lot of you had put in with your the questions right before this, is what do you do about the lack of survivorship information, the lack of integration in materials? Next slide. And I'm going to say this, we know it's an important problem. I don't yet have great resources for this. We don't create a lot of resources, we more identify what's out there. So if anything, I would, and can we go to the next slide? I would encourage you to please try and build resources. Honestly, we need, between all these different cancer care organizations in the United States, we need there to be more survivorship-based resources. We're going to be doing some stuff ourselves. We're really happy that this year we actually got some funding to launch a trans-specific cancer portal. We also got some funding to launch a cancer portal specific to sex, queer sex after cancer. So we're really excited that we're going to be digging into those issues and putting some information up. But right now, there is absolutely too little out there. So any little chip you can make away at that iceberg would be really, really helpful. All right, next one. And just remember that for any one of these issues that we're talking about, once they get kind of overlapped with the layer of intersectionality, and if you're from a population that's experiencing some other level of health disparities based upon your identity in the first place, once you multiply it by this, then that is going to be, in many cases, plenty to stop someone from pursuing their cancer care. So just continue to remember how these things all weave together. All right, next slide. And the Cancer Collaborative is a partner already on the big survey that's going to be redoing this. But the survey is in its last 4 weeks right now, 3.5 weeks even. I'm really delighted to say we already have 1,650 respondents. I also just checked, we have 30 from Wisconsin. So if we get to 50, we will run a Wisconsin specific data sheet on your own sample of queer cancer folks. And yes, Gabe is going to put up a link to become many of you are already promotional partners, but in order to get, new access or to get top posted, all these promotional shareables, there we go. There's the link. And if you already are a partner, if you put your stuff in there again, it'll just remind us to resend you the shareables if you want. But we encourage you to please put it out on your social media accounts, because again, if we can get to 50, we'll have one Wisconsin specific sheet. Yeah, that's the link to the survey itself page, and then the partner page. And if you get if you sign up as the partner, we will send you all these shareables to put on your own social media feed. Well, you did know who Dr. Dizon was. Yes, it was he we were talking to. There you go. Change his name to the Director of Breast and Pelvic Malignancies Program, which is improvement over women cancers, but aren't rectal and prostate cancer also pelvic malignancies? He doesn't treat those. It's confusion, to patients and referring to doctors. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I mean, I have an answer. You're right. Maybe we need to get a little bit better consensus on what it is that we're going to be using instead of women's cancers. Okay, odd story. Doesn't solve this issue, but the odd story is that as American Cancer Society put out their cervical cancer guidelines last year, I think it was, they for the first time made them gender neutral and didn't say like, women this, women that, women this, women that, but instead people with cervixes. And they got a huge amount of pushback from like a right-wing group that's out there. They're not affectionately referred to as TERFs, trans exclusive radical feminists. And you may have heard that their most notorious member is J.K. Rowling. So as they got all this pushback, one of the things they got, they actually think internally might have been a letter directly from J.K. Rowling herself getting upset that they made it gender neutral. So progress is not always linear. It's not always easy. Some people certainly get frustrated, but at the same time, we're out here to try and help serve the vulnerable people among us. And I was really happy with American Cancer Society that they were very clear. They're like, it was the right thing to do, even if we got the pushback. Thanks, Alex. Okay, so Noelle, we will continue to consider that and work with, I guess, Don maybe and suggestions around what to put out there. Okay, next slide. And you, as you can see, you're on here as one of our partners. Next slide, but we still need those 20 more. Noelle, are you from New York? Is that why you know Don? Are you the New York person?
I am 100% from Wisconsin.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Excellent. Perfect. All right, I'm going to jump into terminology for a couple minutes here. We're going to kind of romp through it, to be honest, and that's fine. You'll have access to the slide deck. It's just really kind of, again, terminology is changing a little bit, so just to make sure everybody feels comfortable. So the big takeaways are, do not memorize what you see here. I'm going to give you some general things you can use. Really, what's important is not to be frozen. And if you have public materials you put out, get community advisors to review them, okay? Use LGBTQ+ and feel comfortable with that. But the important thing is just don't be frozen. If you mess up, it's not the end of the world. If you're trying, that's usually what's very clear. Okay, next. So with that said, this is actually just someone's Instagram profile, or for Instagram Wales. And you can see on here that we've got a bunch of people who are the people who run this Instagram profile. Jay is pansexual, asexual, and gender fluid. Ave is male to female. Jax is gay and gender fluid. Sarah is bi and pangender. Dylan is pansexual and asexual. And some of those things you may not be familiar with. The reason I put it here is because it's kind of just this sign that there's a lot of new terminology that's flourishing, particularly among the younger population. But in general, we're really delighted that there's new terms like this. Because just as an example, again, I'm 55, I'm a trans guy, but when I was younger, they tried to tell me I was a lesbian. And guess what? That didn't seem to fit very well. So when I found a term and a phrase and a box that I fit in, that I understood more, it really helped me feel comfortable and like I wasn't alone in a room of different people. We're really tribal beasts and we all want to have kind of our tribe around us. So the more you can find a place where you feel like you're part of a group, the safer it's going to be for all of us. So that's why we like this proliferation of all these different kind of words. And don't be intimidated by them. Understand they're part of people becoming happier and more secure. Next. This is not something we're going to watch now, but it is a good little video. Ask Me by the Chronicle of Higher Education. You can YouTube it. A good little video about how people self-identify and what it means when they are and aren't respected with those identities. Next. Okay, so for this, any questions? Put it in the chat. Any questions on anything you want me to talk about more on this slide? Two-spirit. All right, excellent. So two-spirit is an American Indian term. It's actually a little bit newer. Well, its origins aren't as old as some people claim. The reason why I put it under sexual orientation is particularly two-spirit refers to someone who has elements of the feminine and the masculine embodied in one person, but it sometimes has been incorrectly categorized as being transgender. So I want to put it here to remind people that it can mean any different type of queer in the American Indian, Native American communities. Aromantic. So whenever you put a in front of something, it means the opposite of. So aromantic would be, or aro for short, would be people who do not find themselves to be romantic beings. So that's just kind of not something in their lexicon, in their emotional vocabulary. Make sense? Anything else? Got all the rest up here? I don't believe it. Well, I do believe it if you tell me, but there's usually more people ask about, I will say that. But you're Wisconsin, who knows? Maybe Wisconsin's really advanced. Got Tammy Baldwin, things like that. Yeah, so polyamorous, absolutely. So polyamorous would be a decision that you could have more than one primary relationship. You know, like the common thinking that maybe humans weren't meant to be monogamous. So maybe you have more than one primary relationship that you engage in at one time. So maybe it's a triangle of relationships, or maybe it's multiple kind of like dyads of relationships, one of those two things. But it is something that's actually, yes, very common in our communities. And causes some interesting issues for healthcare. I hadn't thought about that. So Mara, tell us more about that as we go on to the next slide. ACE, I'm just gonna say one more thing here related to ACE and asexual, so people are not sexual. We all see ACE for adverse childhood events, which is a big issue related to later life health disparities, right? But it is a completely different concept. So here, when we're talking about ACE, we're talking about people who do not identify as sexual beings. And whether that's just for, you know, imagine this, whether that's for a few years in your life you identify as that, or for your whole life, in some ways it takes a very complicated, messy part of people's lives off the table. And you can imagine is probably incredibly relaxing for people who choose to adopt that identity label, because, you know, relationships can be a mess. So, you know, identify as asexual, you're just kind of like, I am not into sexual relationships. So gives you a great kind of different conduit to be on, or a pause button, whatever it is in your lifelong trajectory. Oh yes, that makes a lot of sense. Power of attorney in healthcare decision-making, yep. That's a great point. Yeah, risk is non-monogamous, even if it's the same two people for decades. Yeah, and then what do you actually consider primary family? All right, next slide. So I just want to pause for a second here and say something important that a lot of people don't understand, that the biggest group in the queer population are people who identify as some level of bi or pansexual. So you can see here in this survey, it was over half of LGB. And I say that because often the bi community, of which I'm a member, does not get acceptance from the rest of the queer community or the straight community. And we see as a result an increased level of health disparities in the bi population. So if it's kind of like not accepted here or accepted there, it obviously then plays itself out on our health. And that means that if you're trying to do work to outreach the queer populations, you should definitely make sure you have bi-specific outreach materials as the largest subgroup there. All right, next one. gender identity terms, transgender, trans man, trans woman. The big one that I think most people now understand, cisgender, or the opposite of transgender. The big one that's becoming an issue now is NB, or non-binary. NB is just the saying of those two initials, N and B, right? And the non-binary group is really growing. There's actually, between that and gender non-conforming group, was a survey that came out of youth in California that said, I forget the exact number, but it might have been 26% of the young youth population in California identified as either gender non-conforming or non-binary in some way. So as someone who's in like the old school categories of queer, this category is growing so fast that it may take over numbers wise the whole rest of the queer community pretty soon. So that's kind of exciting. Words not to use over there on the right. And then if we can go to the next slide, the third and fourth one there, trans man and trans woman. Oh no, one back, the slide with yellow on it. There we go. You see they look very similar left to right. And I highlighted the space in it on the left is the important thing, because you want to refer to trans people as people who are transgender, not like they are different species. So trans man makes it seem like it's a different species, right? Versus transgender man is a man who has a quality of being transgender. So we want to use it as an adjective. And so that's why that space, even being very tiny, is really is important. Yeah, MTF and FTM not falling out of favor pretty quickly, absolutely. Male to female and female to male. Now we see more assigned female at birth, AFAB, or assigned male at birth, AMAB, being used. But you can see again how these things are kind of fluid, because it's all new language. And in terminology words, that means basically that all of it is baby words, and baby words always flex as they come into, you know, their final iterations. So when words evolve over centuries, many of these are so brand new. They're like newborns. The one thing, if you walk away with nothing else, is never use the word tranny, not even with your friends or things like that, because that comes really from the female sex work world, trans women sex work world, and it's been used as a derogatory and sexual fetishizing word. So it's not good to use in general conversation. That word is the closest to the N word if you refer to the African-American communities. So if I have not now conveyed to you, stay away from it. I don't know how to do it more strongly. Any other questions on this? Yes, exactly. Yes, don't have transgender be the opposite or another category in addition to man and woman, because many people would say, well, I am a man and I also have the quality of being transgender. Like, it's like saying, are you a man, woman, and or a redhead? Well, actually, or a redhead. Are you a man or a woman or a redhead, right? Redhead is an adjective of what type of person you are. So when you put those things on and we see them, we're like, wait, I don't understand how to answer. All right, next one. Is there still pushback from the older queer community on people using queer? Oh, Gabe asked the question. Yes, there is, absolutely. But I think even as now a member of the older queer community, I grew up using it. So I'm you know, we had Queer Nation and everything like that. So also remember that, again, as 55-year-old, older's always shifting, right? But most people my age are not as comfortable using it. And I think that what people understand now is that it is in such open use. It's in the names of many of our national organizations now, that people, I don't think, as long as it's used with the right intentions, have that kind of umbrage. They may not choose to do it themselves, but they don't usually take that kind of umbrage. I still recommend, if you're out community, to use LGBTQ+. Gender queer versus queer, that's a great point. So gender queer, queer is kind of an umbrella of anything that could be either gender identity or sexual orientation that's not mainstream normative, right? Gender queer is a very similar kind of mixing it up in the gender world. But the way it's practically used, it often means people who present with elements of both genders. So, but it's not a really tightly organized definition related to it. It can also be kind of that mixing it up. Let's see, whether non-binary people are trans or not. That's an interesting point, because transgender was originally supposed to be an umbrella. It was supposed to be like the word orange for all oranges, or let's say apples, because we don't know how many different types of oranges there are, but apples, we know lots of varietals, right? And I will say that I think it's failed spectacularly as an umbrella term for people who were gender variant of some stripe or hue. Instead, it has been invoked as like, you know, empire apple, and I'm not going to identify as an empire apple because I'm a Cortland apple. Stuff goes on. So we kind of need something new that is an umbrella term related to gender variant folks. All right, and also intersex is, oops, one back for intersex, exactly. So it's what we used to call hermaphrodites. Now it's, I gotta fix that slide, but it can either be intersex or differences in sexual development. And remember that the health issues and challenges for this population often start in infancy with those unwanted surgeries to make them look gender conforming. So where you get kind of health problems, which create health inequities, is very different than the trajectory and timing of that related to the queer population kind of more in general, or the LGBT population versus I. Okay, next one. All right, so what are things you can say? All of these you can use if you're out community. So that's what I would just encourage. Probably wouldn't use queer unless you're echoing it back to someone. I wouldn't lead with it necessarily, but again, judge your own comfort and how much you interact with the community members, and you may be using that first. And then next slide. If you don't know what all these means, I know you know the first one, right? You know several at the beginning. And alphabet mafia is the new term I learned off of TikTok since we keep adding letters. So we're trying to rein it in by just adding the plus. And then SOGI is usually used around data collection. And SGM is used increasingly. It started with the feds, but it's all over the place now. It's kind of a short way to talk about, again, the whole umbrella, including intersex. Next slide. Okay, so we were going to do something really exciting here, and now we're not, because the Zoom sign-on won't let it do it. But everybody's seeing the pronoun changes. So obviously many more people are using they, them as their pronouns. Historically, that's been grammatically correct for quite a long time, but it hasn't come into custom until pretty recently. Tips and tricks for how to deal with pronoun changes, or someone who comes to you and say, hey, you might have known me as a she, but now please say he. Honestly, practice, have a conversation about them with yourself in the shower or something like that. The more you get used to saying the pronoun that they've requested, the easier it'll come out of your mouth once it actually comes down to crunch time. If you don't know what pronoun to use, the way we fix that secret is we just ask. If you mess it up, say, oops, I'm sorry, and move right on. Don't make a big deal out of it. And then I think you've probably, oh wait, let me go to the next one. My pronouns are, take the word preferred out. So that's one thing. It used to be there, preferred pronouns, and now it's just pronouns, not preferred pronouns. And then the power of an email tagline and Zoom name. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is actually a guy I was talking with just this morning, and I noticed he had a really good example of how he used this in his email tagline. So Josh, pronouns he, him, or they, them. And then he, since he works in a largely out community setting, put, do you know what this means? If you want to know more, click here. And then I've included the link down there so you can add it on to your email tagline. And I just want to say the power of this is, like, you do this once, it takes you about 20 seconds to add it onto your email tagline. And then from then on, every single person you're emailing who's queer sees that you're more welcoming than the average bear. And you've done a huge amount to try and offset this idea that a lot of the world, we don't know if it's hostile or welcoming. Great, good point. If you're a frequent bystander, when someone's using the wrong pronoun, ask that person if they want you to correct others, and do it. It can be very helpful. Yeah, because honestly, I don't, you know, as a trans person, and I was misgendered for much of my life because I didn't pass nearly as easily. And it was endlessly exhausting. I was always appreciative in my particular instance when other people would be like, no, he, you know, instead of making me be like, no, he, you know. So yes, help take the burden off the person that you're trying to, again, show them the path around those hurdles to better healthcare. Next slide then. So what's wrong with this picture? Can anybody tell? What is it? Any ideas? Nothing. All right, go to the next one. The kitten from the other day is missing. That's a great point. Yes, I was frazzled. Okay, next one. You caught me without my pronouns on, unfortunately. So sometimes when you sign, like I have my pronouns set up on Zoom, but when I sign into this, for example, it wouldn't let me fix them. And so as you can see on mine and some other people's, I've added them after my name. So again, it's a real great way how I present to the world for me to, and you may not know I'm trans unless you either know where I work or what I spent my whole life on. But for that, you may not necessarily know I'm trans if I'm in a big room of a whole bunch of people. But with those pronouns, you immediately see that I'm welcoming and or I may not be gender conforming potentially. Most of the people who have pronouns are allies, but some of us who have our pronouns are there are putting them because we're queer. And next slide. Luckily, you can fix that and then everything is much better. And then if we can go to the next slide. I was actually going to ask us all to practice putting pronouns on our Zoom name because usually it's pretty easy on Zoom. You just go to your name and when you hover over your name, there's little dots to the side, to the right side. But on this Zoom, unfortunately, that's been turned off. So the dots just say stop my video, mute my audio, pin, or hide self-view. But usually it says rename. So I encourage you to please, next time you're in, yeah, and Alex says they'll change it for their future webinars. Next time you're in something like this, hover over your name, go to those dots, rename yourself, add those pronouns. Again, it's a beautiful way to just put out a little flag saying, I'm welcoming. And I was gonna have us all do it so I could take a screenshot of all of us on video and then show like pre-pronoun, post-pronoun. But sorry, Alex, we'll do it next time. All right, next slide. One just last note about pronouns. You know, I grew up in a little town that seemed a lot like me. And then, you know, as I continued to grow up, I learned more and more ways that everybody wasn't just like me. You know, we didn't all celebrate the same holidays. We didn't all have the same immigration status. I know this is gonna be a shocking surprise to you, but we weren't actually all trans. So as you learn more about different facets of the world, we learn different things that we didn't even understand to label ourselves as. You know, I learned to label myself as, you know, culturally Christian. I learned to label myself as someone who had enjoyed the privilege of documentation. So pronoun is something we hadn't necessarily thought of for many of us, unless we're in the queer communities. But the more we learn about this, the more we realize these are some of the fences that keep us apart. And doing little things like adding pronouns can be one way to take down those fences. Those are medical academia too. Introducing yourself with pronouns for your intro to students helps normalize this and give safe space. Absolutely agreed. Again, in introductions, in emails, on Zoom, this is the smallest way that you can basically take a rainbow flag that's 60 feet tall and kind of fly it around the stuff that you're doing. So if you're trying to be welcoming, just remember this, every time you don't do that and skip an opportunity to do that, for all those people who may be around you, we're not knowing if you're welcoming or not. So you're perpetuating that fear and concern we have. All right, next slide. You know, I'm gonna have too many slides, so keep asking questions. Shifting demographics. This is just, next slide, please. It's important to note that like this is the number of queer people, that's the bi flag, on the 2017 BIRFIS, which is the adult full population survey. Go to the next slide, please. This is the number of youth. So it's a growing population. And next slide, it's growing quickly. So when I first started these, I used to say that the demographics were about 9 million of us in the country. Now, and I haven't been in work this long, 14.7 million of us, which is about the equivalent of the population of all these states put together. And remember, if you're not clear about it, we do not have our civil rights. So imagine if we had civil rights in this country, except for anybody who was in New Mexico, Georgia, or Rhode Island. That's the situation we're in. Next slide. And just because I think I should probably have Lil Nas in all of my slide decks for one reason or another, I want to point out that actually we also see that in the general population, about 24% of people identify as a racial ethnic minority, but in the queer population, it's 42%. So we actually have a much higher level of racial and ethnic diversity within our population than Gen Pop. Next one. So what does that mean in Wisconsin? I had to give a little love to Green Bay there because as I was Googling a picture of them, I happened to find out they were the 9th happiest city in America. Who knew? It means that you have approximately the same number of queers in Wisconsin as 2 Green Bays plus a few extra people, which is about 221,236 queers. So again, imagine there's this whole population of people who doesn't know whether it's safe to go to a healthcare provider or not. If that isn't justification enough that you should be doing some outreach and you're able to at least convince all the people up to your management, they should be doing some tailored outreach. All right, next slide. And then here is the breakdown of demographics, but we're going to go one slide forward and just to point out, you see the same phenomena echoed in Wisconsin that we see across the country. 29% of Wisconsin queers identify as racial and ethnic minorities versus only 13% of the rest of the people in Wisconsin. So again, we're a much more diverse population for people who are willing to disclose their identity. Next. So what about our lung cancer rates? Next slide. This is where we have these data gaps, which drive us crazy. So the more you can be an advocate to try and help collect data at different healthcare facilities, the big area of advancement on this is really electronic health records. Yes, you're right. Gender ratio should have more than just male and female. I completely agree. These are this is actually comes off of a question where they don't even separate out like T, much less. They just say, are you kind of queer, yes or no? That's kind of the level of what we've got. Next slide. All right, we've already talked about some of these things, the best and promising practices, but I just I'm gonna quickly go through what they are so you can get a sense. And this is a sheet that we have up on our resource library. And it's all, for some of you, it may be straightforward, but for most of you, I'm really going to ask, think about where you work. What are you doing of these things? So next slide. First one is really to understand, while Wisconsin is not on this, we still realize that you were one of the early states to do full queer non-discrimination, if I'm correct, statewide. Minnesota was first, Rhode Island was second. But we know that we're not protected from non-discrimination in all of these states that are in red. So remember that we're always carrying around this knowledge that no one wants to pass nationwide non-discrimination for us yet. It might be different in this current administration, but it's still been a dream that we've been working on for me, certainly my whole adult life. Next slide. So as we come to things with that, including actually, here's information about the level, 69% of employers in Washington, DC wouldn't even call back a trans man who was white masculine like myself, or white trans man, for an entry-level job because the level of discrimination is so high. Next slide. So what are you doing in your organization? One of the things we really suggest are, again, like I talked about, promote your queer employees and help them see they're not just valued, they're not just tolerated for being queer, but they're valued for the expert knowledge they bring about the disparity population. Here's an employee resource group, but people are also creating employee expertise groups, work groups to help the organization do a better job, which is great if your organization is big enough because they know more about where all your skeletons are and what you should be doing than anybody else. And then next slide. This is actually just, people said, what do you want to see welcoming at your organization? And I just want to note on there, the second thing is participating in things like prides. So if you're not participating in Pride, whenever we have one again, it's a great way to show your welcome, and I encourage you to try and encourage it. Next slide. And then of course, all gender bathrooms, another really easy way to communicate welcoming. Next slide. So the second thing is, if you don't, well, we encourage you first to start with your own house, right? After you start with your own house, Get expertise on tap from the community that's on tap, that's staying with you, that's staying looking at your projects through these community advisory bodies. So this is just an example of a video that they have on how to get different groups and community advisory bodies from Consumers United for Evidence-Based Healthcare. Next slide. Here is the American Society of Clinical Oncology recently put together a queer advisory group, and they've been doing a whole bunch of work as a result. Next slide. Their task force has been putting out, they've got a bunch of research out. They've just really gotten some great traction. Next slide. 3, collect data. We've talked about the data gaps. So there's a huge number of ways you can do it. Like, we're really happy that all the quit lines are now collecting data. Next slide. Here's a set of long steps that one hospital system went through in order to turn on their queer data collection. Everybody has it in your electronic health records right now. Just a question whether you flip the switch. But next slide. If you're interested in doing this, we have a whole full webinar on it. You can find it in our resource library. Next slide. And here's just an example of patient forms from a very, very welcoming queer serving health center. It's not a queer health center, it's an FQHC. So here's one example of how a very queer welcoming place has put it together on their entry, on their enrollment forms, so EHR form, intake forms. And remember, that's another way you're conveying welcoming, is if those data collection questions are there. Any concerns about requiring people to disclose sex assigned at birth in order to state that they are trans? Actually, I would have to say kind of no. If anything, the data advocacy point that we're at is that we keep encouraging people to put sex assigned at birth, because that usually, otherwise we're asking sex. And it's kind of a throwaway question when you're asking trans people sex. So sex assigned at birth is usually how we understand and correlate what the potential different risk factor scenarios are. Yeah, you want to do both. I'm sorry, you don't want to just do one or the other. So usually what we're doing right now is we're saying, please add sex assigned at birth. All right, next slide. And then I talked about, the cultural competency training. Here's an example of like that welcoming provider thing. There was a trans welcoming provider list for North Dakota, had 6 organizations on it. And they came in after one training I gave, 70 more providers signed up for it. So, do your work to help goose that like trans welcoming provider list. Next. And then make sure that you have cultural competency standards for your own programs and you're conveying it to the queer communities. If we can't see you're welcoming, we don't know, Next slide. If you work, fund with, or partner with organizations, partnering with a community-based organization is a great way to get that community trust that the community-based organizations have worked so long to do. So you can put their logos on your stuff, you can run events with them, or if you fund, you can fund things with them. Next. And of course, while here's a bright pink mama van, it's an example. This is traditionally African-American, well, there's an African-American sorority, not traditionally, I'm thinking of the HBCUs, that has a mama van, and they have been putting it out there at all sorts of queer events around the country. So it's really great the way they're kind of creating these new partnerships in order to make sure that there's more welcoming places around the country for queers to get their care. And occasionally it's draped with trans flags. Next slide. Thank you, Jennifer. So this is some of the resources we have that you can take, put your logo on it and get out there. So if you don't have any resources for queer screenings or things like that, take this or the next one, please. Or these, next one, you can find them on our resource library. Or this, next one. Or do it in Spanish, whatever you can do. And if you create your own, or this, if you create your own, send them to us to go on the resource library so that we can share them with others too. There's all sorts of different ways that we can get the information out there, but we don't need to all be rebuilding the same wheel. So we have lots of stuff you can put your brand on. And next slide. And then the last really thing in the best practice is, if you have any lessons learned, if you have anything you've created, if you have data you've collected, please make sure it gets back out to our population. And we would be delighted to put as many things as possible from Wisconsin on our resource library. So our resource library isn't just the stuff we've created, it's whatever we can find. So if you've got anything that you think is queer welcoming, or you make something new, please give it to us to put up there, or please find a way to get it back out to your own communities to, again, augment and echo that welcoming. And then I think that is it. Next slide. Oh, this is another example of how they disseminated findings, and it did really well. And remember, when you collect data and give it back out to the community, our organizations can use it to get more funding. Next one. Another way they've done it. And then here we go. The takeaway action steps. If there's nothing else you take away other than don't use the word tranny, these are 4 takeaways that I would love to see you think about with your organization. And obviously we've got a lot of very welcoming allies and advocates, community advocates on the call too. So think also about who you can influence in addition to just your own organization. With that, we only have a few more minutes, but I will stop in case there's any other questions I could not get you to put up before. Oh, and Gabe, I'm sorry, can you come on, Gabe, so I can introduce the guy I talked to during my whole webinar, apparently. There we go. This is Gabe. He's been working in tobacco control forever, and he's newer to cancer, but he is soaking it up like a sponge, and we're really excited to have him be one of our newest trainers, actually. Those aren't questions, those are thank yous. I like thank yous too, though. Those are great. Y'all commit to change it. You're gonna do your pronouns, right? All the people at 0, are you gonna be able to do your pronouns? That's my question, because some of you obviously are kind of. So if you had 0 queers in your life, do you think you'd be able to change your pronouns on your next Zoom call or on your email? Something like that. Come on, I need a 0 to get back to me in the chat. Oh, cool. I love queer health. Thank you, Regina. That's it. Perfect. Yes, Gabe, we can rest. We're good. All right, Alex, I think I'm turning it back over to you then.
Thank you so much, Scout and Gabe. This presentation was so great, and it was so cool to see our membership so engaged during it too. So thank you all for attending and asking wonderful questions. I know I certainly learned a lot. And
I did not get put to sleep, so I love those questions too. I love that.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And so before we close today, I just wanted to highlight a couple resources we have, and then also launch a quick evaluation poll too. But just again, highlighting the survey that Scott mentioned before. I do have the link for that at the bottom. So if you get the slide deck later on today, you will have that easily accessible as well. And just a plug for our upcoming webinar in March, it's going to be for Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month. Stay tuned for more details to come. And then just a reminder that we do have our COVID and cancer research page that you can always go to for updated information on COVID and cancer. And so if you have a moment, we would really appreciate you to fill out our short poll that we just launched. And then after that, feel free to log off. Thank you again so much for attending today, and thank you to our presenters. It was such a pleasure to have you on.
Cool, thanks, Jennifer. I love more resources in there. And you've got a statewide queer conference. It used to be only Puerto Rico did. No, I like the curds, not the cheese hat. The curds,
Please send me a cheese hat. I
don't need a cheese hat.
I lived in Minnesota for 5 years, and I was like, I'm so curious about these cheese hats, and so I need one.
Want the curds, not the hat. I do have an Idaho queer tobacco control buff that can't be a very common piece of swag. You know what I mean? Pronouns, 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 absolutely. You know that there's gonna be some future recording where we're both gonna be wearing cheese hats now, don't you, Gabe? Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. And it'll be like Minnesota, and then they'll get pissed.
Hey Scout, somebody just DM'd me asking if they would be able to reach out to you personally with a couple questions. Is it okay for me to share your contact?
Oh yeah, I'll put it in there. It's just Scout at Cancer Network.
Wonderful.
Or if you want to call me, it's 40126-QUEER. Just in case you're worried I was in the closet. HPV resources. Yes, I think we have everything we showed on our site. I think they were Alaska though, if I'm correct with the HPV thing. So you may have to contact them around the original art. I agreed.
All right, I think
All right, Alex,
that
we good?
wraps it up. I will be
It's a
sure.
wrap.
Yeah, I'll be sure to send you the slides and then the link to the recording as well.
And y'all know where to find us as well. Thanks so much. I really look forward to the kind of changes you're gonna keep making and leadership lots of you had already been taking, clearly.
Yeah.
All right, goodbye, Wisconsin.
Bye, have a nice day.